Today we're going to be tying the Siliclone fly by Mr. Bob Popovic, which is a really fun fly to tie and also a very effective fly, particularly in the fall time when there's mullet on the beach. The great thing about it is it allows you to use some silicone, which is not something we always get to use in our fly tying. And also, we can kind of spin and shape some ram's wool, which is a pretty neat thing to do if you've never done that before. So we're going to be tying the silicone, and then at some point we're also going to be doing a video on the poplip, which is then the kind of later evolution of the silicone. So essentially what we're going to be using for materials today, we're going to be using a Partridge Predator X hook. Go ahead and just put this in the vise. This is a size 6/0. Now again, you can use different hooks. You can use big game style hooks. You can use, what do you call it, Gamakatsu SP11s, whatever style you like. We're just going to use this particular one today, and we're going to be tying a larger fly. So we have our Partridge Predator 6/0, the Predator X hook. We have our Danville 210 denier flat wax nylon. We have some Permastic stick-on eyes. I don't know the exact size of these, maybe 3/8, quarter inch, but use whatever size eyes you have or that you prefer. We're going to be using some Marabou. We have some white Marabou, and we have some yellow Marabou. We've got ram's wool, which this is the material that we're going to be using for making the body of the fly and then coating with silicone. I'm going to be using some Bucktail here, some yellow and white Bucktail. And then we're going to be using some saddle hackle. We've got some yellow saddle hackle, and I'll be using some white Chinese saddle hackle as well. You can use whatever sort of saddle hackle you like. And you can tie this fly with all Bucktail synthetic materials off the tail. It's up to you. You can mess around with it. That's the fun about saltwater fly tying. But first things first, we're just going to go ahead and get some thread on the hook here. All right, so we're going to take a little white Bucktail here. And we're going to tie this in. This is going to be the support for the tail section. And then we could tie our saddle hackle in. I usually like using some Bucktail to support the saddle hackle here. So that way it doesn't foul as easily. But we're going to take some white saddle hackle here. And you know, for the size of this fly, we are going to try and make it pretty big. Not too large, but we are going to put a pretty large head on here, or spin a pretty large head with the ram's wool. So let's go ahead and make this fly right around 6 inches, somewhere around there. We're just going to use a mix of some white saddle hackle and some yellow. And this is just some leftover Chinese saddle hackle I have. It's not even the best. Some of it's kind of twisted. I just untwisted it because sometimes from the way they package it or whatnot, the feathers can get kind of mangled up sometimes. But for a fly that I'm going to fish, I'm never really too particular about the quality of feathers because the fish definitely don't seem to mind. So we're going to tie our 4 saddle hackle in. And if you'd like, you can tent the hackle. You can tie flat wing tails. You can tie it deceiver style. I'm just kind of tying them on there. Not necessarily perfectly flat. I'm adding a little bit of curvature to it. But it's all personal preference on how you want to tie the hackle and what style. So we're just going to get a couple yellow feathers here. And again, even these feathers, they're kind of chunky yellow feathers. But we'll just take about 1 on either side. And I'm just going to kind of tie this on the upper half here. Just at a slight angle. Kind of what we call tenting, so I can kind of still have some white on the bottom there and have that yellow on top. So that kind of favors the upper half, and we still have some white peeking off the bottom. Let's grab another one here and do that on the opposite side. And again, tie these in whatever colors you like. I like yellow and white for the surf. I remember some photos you'll see we're going to tie a poplip in the school bus bomber style. I remember seeing some photos in the Popovic's book of some yellow ones that I really like. So it's kind of a classic color for the surf, in my opinion, for striped bass. I've got some gold flash here. Now this is completely mangled, but this is like some pike flash boo, so it's quite long, but we'll take some gold flash boo here. I'm going to make this pretty flashy so it sticks out in the water. I'm going to fold that over to where it's the size that we can use, a little bit more practical. I'm just going to fold that right over the hook, tie that, and then make sure that it's essentially laying on either side somewhat evenly here. Amount of flash on either side, and if you don't want it to be as flashy, you know, it's all personal preference on how much you want to use. If I'm fishing in the surf and there's striped bass or bluefish blitzing on mullet, I don't mind making it a little flashy personally. So, and again, you can tie them in blue, yellow, and white, or you know, blue, gray, and white for mullet, whatever. I don't think necessarily color always matters too much. It's more about presentation, but you can make them whatever color you like. So we just happen to have a lot of yellow ram's wool here. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take some white bucktail, and we are going to tie this on the belly, and I'm going to tie 1 or 2 bucktail collar sections here. We'll keep yellow on top, white on the belly. We're going to go all yellow for the head just because I don't have any white ram's wool. We'll get some of that for when we tie the poplip, but we'll tie our first collar here just a little bit ahead of the tail section that we tied. And we're just essentially trying to build a bait fish profile here. We're adding some body to the fly. You can think of kind of like a bucktail deceiver almost. We're doing a couple collars of bucktail here, adding some length and adding some volume to it. And the great thing is with that silicone head up front, that big round head, is you're going to see how we're going to make the tail here. All this material is going to move really well when it comes to swimming in the water. So that's why we like using Marabou, Bucktail, Saddle Hackle, a lot of natural materials that kind of have great movement in the water naturally, or have great movement in the water even when you're not stripping the fly. So we want to leave ourselves enough room here. You can see I pretty much tied all the material up to a certain point, and I'm leaving a good amount of this fairly bare other than just some thread. This is where we're going to be making our head, so I'm going to try and squeeze a little bit more bucktail. It's okay if we go a little bit more forward, but I want to leave myself enough room to kind of have a nice amount of space to tie that ram's wool on there, so we can spin that and get a nice head to coat with some silicone. So we'll do a little bit more bucktail just because I want to get a little bit more of a kind of profile going, larger profile. Okay, so we're going to need some white Marabou and yellow Marabou here. So we'll grab some yellow Marabou for the top. We're going to tie this in the way that we tied in the Marabou on the fly in our last video, the Mullet Marauder. And we're just going to essentially kind of just pluck the middle section here with the stem. We're going to use this Lawner Marabou, and we're just going to tie it in. We're going to do that a couple times here. The reason why in particular I kind of plucked that middle section there is I don't like having the end of the Marabou quill on the Lawner one sticking out. So get some yellow for the top here. Again, you can strip the Marabou off if you want. This is just kind of a little bit of a quick way to tie it. A lot of times when I'm tying these flies for myself before I'm going out fishing or something, or the night before, you know, I don't want to sit there, and I just want to kind of whip these up and get them ready to go and let them dry up. You do need to wait a certain amount of time for the silicone to dry before you fish it. But so we got some white Marabou here, and we're going to tie this in. And again, I kind of just stripped some of the middle there so it can kind of fit between the hook a little bit better. And now we have a really nice fluffy back section to the fly. And we're ready to do some ram's wool spinning to make a nice fluffy receptacle for some silicone. It's an interesting way of saying it, but so we have our ram's wool. It's always a good idea to have a brush with this sort of stuff and brush it out. Just have a dog brush here, an old dog brush. That's just going to make the material a lot easier to work with. That size depends, you know, the size of the fly. If it's a smaller hook, I would think about maybe tying a little bit less material in. But we're going to use, essentially, we're just going to cut off a section of the ram's wool, and we're going to tie it on. Very similar to how we tie deer hair when we spin it, but there's a little trick to this. You're not really actually spinning this, so the trick that Mr. Bob Popovic shows in his book is we're going to open the material up like this to where it's almost like a flower petal, right? And what we're going to do is, we'll get our thread ready here, kind of wrap this down a little bit. Get my thread right in front of that. What we're going to do is I'm actually going to kind of split it at one little spot so there's a little V shape, but I'm going to slip that right over, and then I'm going to come here and grab it on the other side. And what I want to do is I want to, exactly where my thread is, which should be right in front of where we stop the bucktail, I want to do a couple, like 3 or 4 tight wraps like we would if we were spinning deer hair. But I want to do it right in the middle of where the material is. Now it's kind of hard to see because I'm grabbing it, but I need to hold it with one hand. So I'm going to do kind of a light wrap first. You could see I kind of gave it a little leeway because it was about to catch itself and kind of wrap up unevenly, but it'll essentially kind of guide itself. But now what we can do is we have about 3, 4, 5 tight wraps. What I found is if you do too many wraps and you have too large of a thread buildup, you're going to get these gaps when you trim it. And you don't want any gaps when you're covering this in the silicone. It's going to have all sorts of little divots or dives or dips, I should say, in the material, and it's going to fill up with silicone. So you want to get these collars just as if you were spinning deer hair. You want to get them as clean and as tight as possible to where there's really no gaps when you trim it. So you got to be careful with how much thread that you wrap. But now we have our material on here, and I'm just going to use a little pressure here just to make sure it's kind of pushed back and it's tight. And I'm just going to find a little spot. I essentially just created a little V where I can slip the material through without catching anything, kind of like how we do with hollow flies or spinning hair, right? And then I'm just going to wrap in front a couple times and lock that down, just like this. So I'm going to grab another section here. Essentially all we're going to do is keep tying these ram's wool collars until we fill it up, and then we're going to go ahead and pick it out and trim it and cover it in some silicone. So I'm going to go ahead here and just start tying these on, trying to get them as tight as possible, and getting a nice fluffy ram's wool head here. Let's go ahead. So we're brushing this out here. The other thing we're going to do is you can also use a bodkin or a pick, and I always do this anyway. And I like to stick this in pretty much as close to the hook shank as I can without getting into the thread wrapping. And all we're going to do with this is we're going to essentially go through and we're going to poke out. A lot of times you'll find the material kind of wraps over itself and gets kind of caught under itself, and what will happen is you'll get these gaps when you trim it, particularly when you trim a lot of it. But we're going to leave this head pretty big. But just to make sure, do it the right way, we're just going to pick all the material out and make sure that it's nice and it's breathing well. It's not suffocated, you know. So now, just like trimming the deer hair in the snake fly in one of the previous videos that we did, we're going to be using a our trusty pair of Fisker's scissors, which I get these from my local hardware store, and this is what I do all of my fly tying commercially and for fun as well. So I go about through 2 pairs of scissors of these every year, but these Fisker scissors, I don't know if you could see that. I'm sure you could find these somewhere. They're like $15, and I absolutely love these things. So no fancy Dr. Slicks for me or anything, but what we're going to do is take our scissors and we're going to angle it outwards, and we're just going to slowly start to trim the shape of the fly. We're going to go for like a bullet head shape, kind of a round mullet shape. It's all dependent on whether you want it, you know, kind of chunky on the sides, maybe a little bit more up on top, you know, however you want to do it. And, you know, just take your time and make sure you angle your scissors outwards, because the last thing you want to do is accidentally cut too far inwards and take a chunk out of the fly. All right, so I'm going to take these and I'm going to trim them outwards. So I'm just going to angle my scissors outwards, and I'm just going to slowly trim the head here. Just start getting that shape going. You can see I kind of also slightly pull the material out. I'm not like putting too much pressure on it. I'm just guiding it. You got to realize you're going to be coating this with silicone, so don't make the head too big for the size hook that you're using. And I always like to leave a little bit of ram's wool in between the Marabou, just so it kind of has a little bit more of a natural look, doesn't just abruptly end. So I'm going to be very careful about trimming and not trim too far back, so we have a little bit of ram's wool. And again, just work on the shape here. Take your time, you know. Take a break, have a sip of beer or vodka and cranberry, whatever you're working with. We're just gonna try and get that head to where we want it to be. And I'm going for a pretty round shape. I don't mind if it's a little bit thicker on the sides, you know. Just don't want that material that I guess you don't want the belly section to be taller than the top section, because once it's coated with silicone, that could actually cause the fly to possibly want to turn upside down, because it'll have a larger air pocket on the bottom. So I always try and have the belly section just be a little bit shorter, just a hair, than the top. You can always take it off the vise and eyeball it from there, but I'm not really getting too I'm not going to be too crazy about it. If you ever watch my Twitch streams, I've been known to sit there and trim a fly for 10 to 15 minutes to try and get it perfect, but that's just some OCD coming out. Okay, that should be pretty good. That's pretty round. We'll give you kind of a front perspective here. You can see my wastebasket's full of ram's wool, but now we have a pretty nice head, and I think it's time to try and put some silicone on this bad boy and make it a full-fledged silicone mullet fly. An important little step here, there's a couple things you can use. You could either use photo flow, which is actually what Bob Popovic recommends in his book Pop Flies when it comes to dealing with silicone and smoothing silicone, and also making it less sticky on your fingers or whatever you're working with. I think you can use either a bodkin or a popsicle stick to kind of smooth it in the end. I'm actually going to be using some gloves when I put the silicone on with my finger. You can also use the bodkin. We'll do it in a couple different ways. The only reason I'm going to put a glove on is because I play guitar and I don't want silicone on my hands, because it can be pretty hard to get off sometimes. But this right here is going to help us smooth the silicone. You can get a much smaller bottle. I just got this off Amazon. It's going to last me a long time. I'm not worried. I don't think the expiration thing matters when it comes to using it in this particular manner. The other thing is you could possibly use is Purell, but, you know, nowadays that's in high demand. It's a commodity, so we don't want to waste some Purell on a silicone fly. But you can. Essentially all you're doing is, I guess, the alcohol in it or whatever chemical solution that's in the photo flow is going to stop the silicone from sticking to whatever you're smoothing it out with, whether it be your finger that you're applying it with or whether it be the bodkin that you're using to smooth it out, right? So we've got our stick-on eyes, and we've got our silicone here. Now for the silicone, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, we've got our Devcon here. I used to use GE household silicone. This is what I used to get from Saltwater Flies back in the day. I don't think they have any silicone now on the website, and I don't know if you can still find the GE household silicone. But I got this Devcon here from Amazon, and it seems to work pretty good. Not all silicone works equally well for tying saltwater flies. I think I used Liquid Nails was one of them I got from a local hardware store, and I think it was like a waterproof clear. You always want to try and get clear so you can see the material underneath it, but it just didn't work that well, and it wasn't the right silicone. So this Devcon seems to work pretty well, so you can find this on Amazon for a pretty relatively cheap price. Now, one thing is you always want to put your cap on, and you also want to be careful because the fumes from this stuff are pretty hardcore. So I mean, maybe you're into that sort of thing, but I recommend opening up a window. So what I'm going to do is, I should really have thought about this in terms of the photo flow, but I'm going to have a little... You could keep a little cup with some of this photo flow, so you could dip your finger in it or something like that, because you periodically might need to apply a little bit to your finger here. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour a little bit of this stuff onto my finger. Now, you got to be careful. This is another reason to use gloves if you're going to use your fingers to apply it. Or, I mean, you could certainly use the bodkin. I'll show you how you can do that as well. But, you know, I don't know if I necessarily want to get this stuff all over my hands and into my, all over my skin. Anyways, what we're going to do is, you could use your finger, or you could also just kind of take some silicone and essentially kind of bead it up on the fly. Kind of lay a couple beads of it, right? You could also take a little bit to your finger and apply it that way. I'm going to use one finger with the silicone, and I'll use another finger with the what do you call it? Photo flow. But all we're going to do essentially is just kind of take our silicone here, and if you have a clip to hold back the material, that's great. But if you don't, I'm showing you here, you can just hold the material with one finger. You could always use those kind of paper organizing clips. But if you don't happen to, that's all right. And we're just going to get a nice layer of that silicone on there. You want to evenly coat it. You may need to add a second coat. It all depends. I think we'll probably be able to get away with a single coat here. That's looking pretty good. I might just want to add a little bit more, so I'll take my finger here, and I'll just put a little bit more silicone on there. All I'm going to do is just kind of evenly spread that around, get that nice round shape that we think about when we think about mullet. I like to kind of just lightly push that silicone back to where it kind of coats on to maybe a little bit of that Marabou too, and just kind of flows together to where we get that nice shape. So I'm just taking the photo flow here, and this is just to smooth it out. I think we probably could have gotten away without it because we did a pretty clean job when it came to spreading this stuff around. But this is just essentially just going to smooth it up. It makes a big difference, especially when tying the poplips, I think, of using the photo flow. I'll give you a close-up here. You can see how the photo flow does its job and kind of smooths out that silicone. You'll find a lot of times it'll kind of you'll get little jagged edges if you don't smooth it out with something, because it's very, what'll happen is when you either use a bodkin or a popsicle stick or your finger, the silicone will kind of lift off because it sticks to whatever you're using. So the photo flow essentially just stops the silicone from doing that and allows you to get a nice smooth finish to it. So now what we can do is let's take some eyes, and we're just going to stick some eyes on while we're at it. Normally I would do a couple coats, but we did a pretty good job with this one. And I don't want to put too much silicone on there. It's something I've tried to shy away from. I think I used to put a little too much silicone back when I tied them, you know, when I first started getting into them. Now I try to use a little bit less to cut down on weight and just make the fly a little bit more refined for my liking. But what I'm going to do here is I like to take the eyes and kind of pre-bend them a little. If you can see that, we kind of bend them slightly so they stick to the silicone better for the shape of the head. And I'm just going to stick that on there like so. I'm doing this with the bodkin to make it easier, and also so I don't get any silicone on my hands. Try and get them essentially as even as possible when it comes to lining up, but I'm not going to be too particular about it. I don't think any big bluefish or stripers care. There we go. Now we're looking good. So last thing, I'm just going to take a little bit of silicone with my bodkin here and just cover the eye very lightly. We might need to break out a little bit of photo flow, but we'll see. I think we'll be all right. You don't want to add too much to where you get a big kind of, you could see a big amount of silicone covering the eye. You just want a decent amount, but not too much. Just a light enough layer to really lock down that eye so it's not going to go anywhere. You know, even if the eye does get beat up, I have a couple poplips that I tied years ago that I still fish for largemouth bass with. You know, they're certainly going to work fine even without an eye. So, but you know, the reason we put eyes on there, maybe even give us a little bit more confidence about fishing the fly. All right, just smooth that out a little, and all we got to do is let this thing dry and it'll be ready to fish. Unfortunately, it's December 23rd, so I don't think we'll be fishing this fly in the near future. We probably could find a fish or two hanging around and probably even catch them on this thing, but I think I'll be waiting until next spring. So, but next time we do, maybe go head out to the surf and try and catch some stripers, which will probably be 2021. This is definitely going to be one of the flies in my box. So, and again, you can see the big round head here really gives us that quintessential mullet look, right? Which is essentially very hard to replicate with something just like a deceiver when you're fishing for larger game fish like striped bass or bluefish, and they're keyed in on these bigger bait fish. When you're using something that's essentially what I would describe as a two-dimensional fly, let's say, like a deceiver, compared to something that's more like a three-dimensional fly, you know, that has a much larger profile and that can push water, which fish can pick up with their lateral line. You know, this is certainly going to make a disturbance in the water. You know, whether you fish it with a sinking line underwater or you fish it with a floating line or intermediate and it stays near the top and throws a wake. But the other nice thing about having a big round head on here is that it's going to hit this material. It's going to hit that little bit of ram's wool, that marabou, all that flash boo, that saddle hackle and bucktail, and all that stuff's going to have great movement, which anytime you fish a fly in the surf, even when you're not stripping it, there's always some current, there's some white water. I like putting marabou, you know, lawn saddle hackle, some lawn flowy flash in there, just to kind of get that extra movement in the fly. A lot of times you may even have a fly, you know, a fish come up and hit it on the paws, or when it's just kind of drifting over a sandbar or something, or just sitting in the whitewash. So anyway, that's the Simple Cone Fly by Bob Popovics. And at some point we're going to be working on a poplip version as well. So hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and we'll see you next time.